This is the first of three videos. It kind of serves as an introduction. I want to sort of define social cultural history, and then I want to give you some background on the broader American history. I'm going to talk about aspects of culture later in this class, but if you don't understand events and people that I may be referencing, you won't understand that discussion of culture. And so these first videos are going to give you the context and the broad sweep of American history. This first video of the three videos is going to look at the colonial American context. But before I get into that, I'll need to define social cultural history. Social cultural history is bottoms-up history. It's studying the daily lives of the masses, not as much the lives of the elites or political leaders, sort of the average man and woman. It first grew up in the 1960s, and it argued that mass movements drove events, not the actions of a few people. All the changes in society and culture, they were driving historical change, not the elites who just reacted to these broader movements. And social cultural historians look at history more in the aggregate, summarizing broad sweeping developments, and don't look at things like politics, laws, diplomacy, or even the economy as much as other historians would. It's going to analyze things like people's attitudes and their customs, their lifestyle, religion, entertainment, dress, food, technologies, education, and so forth. All of the different topics that we're going to talk about later in this class. The obvious problem teaching social culture history is that it requires broad sweeping generalizations, and there are always exceptions. What is the average man? The social cultural historian, therefore, needs to be careful not to overgeneralize or be too inclusive. There are always subcultures and then subcultures. The study of culture becomes the study of a series of cultures. And at some point, you got to stop and say, well, can you make any conclusions about American culture? It's dealing with social cultural history. You are in fact dealing with generalizations, and so I want to point out that the points I'm making don't apply to every individual. Another problem for the social cultural historian is losing sight of how the average or common man viewed himself in his day, in the past. Because social cultural historians see history as driven by the overriding masses, operating perhaps in fragmented groups, but nevertheless powerful, the historian may forget that the people themselves saw themselves as powerless against the wealthy or elites. If a social cultural historian overstresses the power of the masses, they may misconstrue an important factor in people's actions, their assumptions that they were powerless. This course is organized differently than other history courses, as it will not follow chronologically events from week to week. Rather, it's divided into these aspects of culture: religion, housing, clothing, food, and so forth. And then, within each aspect, it proceeds chronologically from Native Americans to modern times. Of course, no single aspect of culture is independent from the broader historical context, and for this reason, this first video provides a brief survey of American history. The larger events that took place in such areas as politics, economics, and foreign policy that underscore so much of our nation's past. In many instances, these events affected all aspects of culture, and thus are frequently mentioned in the videos each week. If students don't know these events or understand their broader chronological context, they may be confused later in the videos. This video may seem simplistic to many history majors, but this course is offered for general education credits, and many non-history majors may be enrolled. No essay questions will directly pertain to this first video, but again, the information may prove instructive in any essays on culture directly related to videos later in the course. To begin, you got to understand that American history from European colonization to the present extends over 5 centuries. And it goes all the way from the 16th century to, of course, today's 21st century. By the way, when I speak about the 16th century, just to be clear here, we're talking about the 1500s, the 17th centuries, the 1600s, and so forth. We're living in the 21st century. But if you're looking at the period of American colonial history, you're talking about a long period. I mean, from the point of English settlement in the early 17th century until American independence in the late 18th century, that's almost 200 years. And in those years, the colonies go from a few small settlements right on the coast to a pretty substantial populated area extending from Georgia all the way up to Maine and pretty deep into the wilderness. In that 200 years, the way people live is going to change dramatically. Their culture is going to change dramatically. So when I speak of American colonial history, be aware that it's 200 years from English settlement to independence, and a lot changes in that period. Of course, Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, bumped into the New World in the 1490s, in the late 15th century. And they found a bunch of gold there, and that led to the colony of New Spain, which was extensive. It covered the Caribbean, Central America, and parts of South America. And there are a lot of gold and wealth there, and the Spain became the dominant power in the 16th century. Other European countries wanted to get a piece of the action, and in the late 16th century, late 1500s, there were the first attempts at English settlement in the New World. These attempts didn't succeed until the early 17th century, when in the area they called Virginia, the English founded in 1607 the colony of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement. About 10, 15 years later, you started seeing the first so-called pilgrims landing at Plymouth up in Massachusetts Bay. That was in 1620. And about 10 years after that, there were a flood of these Puritans who established Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630s. As English migration grew in the 17th century and new English colonies began to spread on the eastern seaboard, other rival countries also sought to establish North American colonies. The Dutch tried to settle the Hudson River Valley, including the key town at the mouth of the Hudson River, New Amsterdam. The Dutch controlled this area until the English took it over in the 1660s and renamed it New York. The French were also attempting to establish a North American colony, but because the English and the Dutch dominated the eastern seaboard, the French focused further northward, settling the St. Lawrence River and eventually exploring and claiming the Great Lakes area and the Mississippi River Valley. The French claimed, therefore, a wide swath of land, but had few settlements. It remained difficult for the French to settle that interior land. By 1750, the middle of the 18th century, the English had established a series of colonies that stretched from New Hampshire and Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south. They were founded for both economic and religious reasons, involving different groups at different times. They didn't claim as much land as their rivals, the French, but with their seacoast ports and good agricultural lands, these English colonies grew and attracted a number of immigrants from other countries. By this point, the middle of the 18th century, the English colonies on the seacoast included people of Dutch, French, German, Scots-Irish, and Swedish descent, and small numbers of other groups such as Irish Catholics and Jewish people. Then, of course, there were the large number of people of African descent. In the first U.S. Census in 1790, it was determined that 40% of the population had non-English heritage. Now, this is critical because, of course, all of these people brought their own cultures and traditions, making the English colonies diverse. Some of the first non-English immigrants to arrive in the early 17th century, the early 1600s, were Swedes and also French Protestants known as Huguenots. Regarding the Huguenots, the Protestant Reformation had not transformed France, which remained Catholic. As religious dissidents, Huguenots were often not poor, and they tended to settle in towns. Here you can see on a map on the left, the Swedes first settled around the area that eventually became Philadelphia. As the 17th century progressed, German and German-speaking Swiss began to arrive. The Protestant Reformation had swept across Central Europe, and there were a number of small principalities existing. If a person didn't agree with the religious views of their particular ruler in their own principality, they were often persecuted. The first Germans settled in Pennsylvania, and by the end of the colonial era in the late 18th century, they numbered approximately 100,000, composing one-third of that colony. By the end of the colonial period, they had migrated westward, most notably in the Carolinas and Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Later in the 17th century, you begin to see Scots-Irish immigrants arriving. Originally people from the lowlands of Scotland, they had first migrated to Ireland, but there they faced discrimination since they were Protestants and Ireland was largely Catholic. By the end of the colonial era, the Scots-Irish numbered over 250,000 people, comprising 14% of America's non-English population. By the 18th century, the Scots-Irish had moved constantly westward, always extending the frontier. They became known as fierce fighters and explorers. By the end of the colonial era, the Scots-Irish were well into settling areas beyond the Appalachian Mountains, into areas such as Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee. By the end of the colonial era in the late 18th century, there were small numbers of Jewish people, primarily centered in larger towns like New York City. The Protestant Reformation had swept across Holland, and the country had become known for its religious toleration, as had its colony of New Amsterdam. After the English took over, New York City had grown much more diverse, and there, unlike many other areas of English control, there was more religious toleration. Of course, a large percentage of the population were people of African descent. They were, of course, centered in the southern colonies, where the colonial era slavery had thrived. Slavery, of course, was America's so-called original sin, an aspect of American society, economy, and culture that dramatically impacted American history. To understand how slavery developed in the English colonies and why it thrived in the South, one must look at how the northern and southern colonies developed differently over the 17th and 18th centuries. These differences between the North and the South were also influential in American history beyond slavery. First, I'm going to look at the northern colonies. We're talking about the areas from New Hampshire and Massachusetts down to about New Jersey. In general, in the northern colonies, the winters were longer and the growing season shorter. In the most northern of the colonies, the mountains were closer to the ocean and the soil was rockier. There were also more natural ports. All of this discouraged agriculture as the primary industry and encouraged the growth of towns. The northern colonies therefore developed a more urban and commercial, manufacturing-based economy and culture as the years passed. Now when we turn to the southern colonies, I'm basically talking about the area from about, Maryland, Delaware down to Georgia. They were much different than the northern colonies. A lot of the South had what was called a wide tide water, where the rivers, you could see the tides from the ocean. And that's shown in green here in the Virginia colony. And all of this meant that there was a lot of really, good arable land. The mountains were further back from the ocean. Also, there were a few good harbors, but there were these wide rivers. And so the South developed a pattern of large landed estates or plantations, unlike the North. These large landed estates grew staple crops, a great volume of crops used for sale and not for the people's own consumption. The wide rivers meant that ocean-going ships could land directly to individual estates or plantations. There's less need for cities. Most plantations have their own wharfs. Also in the South, the king tended to distribute the land more in large grants to rich aristocratic proprietors, rich people. Staple crops demanded a lot of labor, and indentured servants at first filled the demand. Indentured servants were poor people that wanted to come to the New World for opportunity but couldn't afford the expensive cost of the transport. And so what they would do is they'd promise to work for a person in the New World for a set period of years. At the end of that period, they could be free. And so the person in the New World would pay the cost. And initially, this filled the demand for labor on these large plantations. People of African descent first arrived quite early in American history, in the early 17th century, about 1619. And here you can see a picture of them arriving in Jamestown. There was no slavery in the English New World at this period as such. These first blacks were sort of partitioned out as indentured servants. There are also many, of course, white English indentured servants, but the first Africans that came were indentured servants. Now, I don't want you thinking the lives of indentured servants was easy. It was harsh and laborious, and the people they worked for would treat them often cruelly, and it was very strictly regulated. As the Virginia and Chesapeake region grew, you're going to begin to see discrimination against blacks increasing. The length of indentured servant contracts for blacks began to increase. Instead of like 7 years for a white indentured servant, you'd often have 10 or 15 or 20 years signed for people who were of African descent. The indentured servant contracts eventually became pretty much servitude for life. And when you speak of slavery, you're talking about somebody who's like chattel property and they work for life. And moreover, if they have any children, the children are the property of the owners and so forth. It goes in perpetuity. The first statutes codifying slavery as we know it this way, outlining codes of conduct, were in Virginia in 1661 and 1662. These codes became fairly uniform as the other colonies adopted slavery. Slavery was defined by the status of the birth mother. Slaves found guilty of murder or rape were to be hanged, while punishments for lesser crimes remained severe. Slaves would be treated as chattel property, as I say, able to be purchased and sold, and with virtually no restrictions on the owner's treatment. Looking at how, more specifically, slavery developed from indentured servants, how it developed around African people, you got to start with the staple crop that these Chesapeake and Virginia colonies are growing, tobacco. Tobacco was a very time-consuming and laborious process, growing tobacco. It required a lot of workers. Given the high profits growing tobacco in America, production of tobacco soon outstripped European demand. In short, there was a glut of tobacco. Tobacco production just grew tremendously. Inevitably, in the mid-17th century, there was a bubble. The bubble popped, and there was a dramatic drop in the prices for tobacco in colonial America. They just overproduced. And what these large plantation owners did was they decided to sort of cut labor costs rather than actually cut production and drive prices up. They're going to see if they can cut their costs for labor. Now, while this was going on, we're talking the middle of the 17th century, mortality rates are dropping in the colonies. The colonies are becoming more developed and people were living longer. Now, for the first time, more indentured servants were completing their promised period of servitude, when their master would have to set them free and then purchase a new indentured servant contract. Before, most would simply die before the end of their contract. Facing the new reality of having to purchase a series of indentured servant contracts, the possibility of slavery became a cheaper alternative. While a slave would cost more at the outset, he'd have to work for life, and before it didn't make economic sense to pay more for a slave when most people would die within a short period anyway. Slavery, therefore, grew out of the tobacco indentured servant economy. Now, Africans were seen as perfect for slavery. The Spanish had already used African slavery in the New Spain to great profits, and because Africans appeared so different, it was easy to distinguish between who was a slave and who was not. Moreover, English culture had long perceived anything dark or black as evil. So the growth of these colonies, the immigration and the development of slavery sort of defined the 17th century. When you get into the 18th century, a big movement known as the Enlightenment is going to sweep across Europe and America, primarily among the educated and upper classes. It stressed that God had created natural laws that governed the universe, and that mankind could study these nature and figure out ways to use these natural laws, to mankind's advantages. This led to tremendous increases in knowledge in such areas as science and medicine. The Enlightenment also caused a reaction, especially among the less well-educated and lower classes, the so-called Great Awakening. It was an emotional revivalism in religion, stressing that God did, in fact, control everything, and that God would punish those who digressed. The Great Awakening in the middle of the 18th century increased evangelism and led to the formation of new religions. By the middle of the 18th century, the English colonies had begun to grow so much that inevitably they're going to bump into the French. And the French had not populated the areas they claimed, and they were trading with the Indians. And so the English, on the other hand, they populated. They cut down trees, and Indians didn't like them. So inevitably a war broke out in the middle of the 18th century. We call it the French and Indian War. It was from an English perspective that they were fighting the French and Indians. And it went from 1754 to 1763. And long story short, by 1763, the English had won, and they kicked the French out of New France, and the English controlled all the way to the Mississippi. You can see it here in this map in red. The Enlightenment did more than just increase knowledge and science and medicine and improve people's lives. It also undermined the divine right of kings. Now, why does the king rule? Well, the king would tell you that he rules and you have to follow because God made him king. That's divine right. But if God is just making natural laws that govern the universe, God doesn't control everything that happens on a daily basis, then that kind of undermines the rationale for having kings. Well, the Enlightenment and the French and Indian War contribute to the American Revolution. After the English won all the lands from the French, they had a large war debt, and they're going to begin to tax the American colonists. The American colonists, of course, didn't like to be taxed. The Enlightenment, of course, undermined the divine right of kings, and all this sort of adds up and contributes to the American Revolution, which was fought between 1765 and 1783 when America won its independence. This concludes this first of 3 introductory videos, just looking at introducing a broad sweep of American history.